Welcome. I'm David Allen Voiles, the host of Tales from the Hearse, and tonight I want to share a story with you from Riverside Cemetery. It's a beautiful graveyard, as you've probably noticed. It's full of wonderful mausoleums, tombstones, statues. But you may have noticed that some of these statues have been damaged. They're missing their heads or arms. And you probably wondered what in the world happened. Well, to tell the truth, no one really knows exactly what happened. But a story is told, and I want to share that story with you tonight. Now, Riverside Cemetery is bordered on three sides by the Montford community. It, of course, has an iron fence around it, as most cemeteries do, but that's not really much of an obstacle for anyone who really wants to get into the graveyard after sunset when the gates are closed. Well, back in the 1920s, there were two young fellows, just children really, who were pranksters. They were what we call today ne'er-do-wells. You know the term, someone who from birth was predicted never to amount to anything good in their lives. These fellows were always up to mischief, and they had decided that they wanted to play a prank on one of the employees of the graveyard, a fellow named Caleb Williams. Now, Caleb was a big, strong, strapping fellow, strong of body but a little weak of mind. Very easy prey for someone who wanted to play a trick on him, as these two fellows did. Well, what these two miscreants had planned was this. They thought it would be fun to create a ghost and scare old Caleb Williams on Halloween night. So what they did is quite clever. They concocted a scheme in which they got an oil lamp. They covered it with a sheet and suspended it with a rod so that as they ran through the graveyard in their dark clothing, it would appear that a ghost was indeed floating about the graveyard. Well, they had some fun with that themselves, thinking themselves to be as clever as they actually were. And then they decided, well, it would be better if they suspended that ghost from one of the low-hanging branches of a tree over the tombstone so it would let the breeze kind of float it about and let it seem as if it was hovering over the graves. And they could hide in the bushes and wait for Caleb to come about on his appointed rounds. Well, that's exactly what they did. There in the darkness they waited, and indeed here came Caleb, as the reliable employee that he was, checking to make sure that the graveyard was all right. Now, we can't really say whether that ghost scared Caleb or not. But ultimately, being the reliable employee that he was, he knew that he had to take this object down out of the trees. And being the tall fellow that he was, it was quite easy for him to grab the branch, pull it down, and unhook the lantern. But when he did, that lantern tilted, and the oil within spilled out and ran down the sheet and over his clothing and ignited, turning poor Caleb Williams into a human torch. Well, it was a horrible way to die. Now, you and I, perhaps, might have immediately gone to get help, but these two fellows, all they thought about were themselves, and they ran off and kept their mouths shut. And apparently that worked, for they got off scot-free. Well, years later, on another Halloween, it was a misty, drizzly, cold evening, and they were milling about their neighborhood looking for some sort of mischief that they could get in, when they happened to notice this old black Ford truck pull up into the neighborhood and stop in front of one of the houses. The driver got out, went around to the back of the truck, picked up one crate of many, and carried it to the front door of one of those houses. He knocked on the door, looking quite surreptitiously up and down the street while he waited. And then someone came to the door, motioned him to come in quickly, and the two men went in and were concealed within the darkness of the house. Well, our two ne'er-do-wells looked at each other and smiled because they thought there must be something quite interesting in the back of that truck. Well, they went to investigate, and they opened one of the other boxes to find that there within the crates were many jars filled with clear liquid. Now, by this time, it was the 1930s. That was the Prohibition era. So you know what was in those jars. Moonshine. Illegal liquor. Well, each of the two fellows grabbed a jar and off they went to find a good place to consume their ill-gotten gains. They jumped the fence into the cemetery, figuring that was the perfect place, and on this drizzly evening they took shelter under one of the eaves of the crypts in the cemetery. Well, after a good bit of drinking, it didn't matter whether it was a torrential downpour. As far as they were concerned, it didn't matter. And they began to have some fun. They wrestled and tussled. And at that time, there happened to be crabapple trees in the park, and crabapples were lying all around the ground. And they started picking those up and hurling them at each other. Well, eventually they came upon a crypt that was actually a holding crypt, something where they put temporarily bodies that were not quite ready to be buried yet. And sometimes that crypt was used for storage. Well, leaning up against the side of that crypt was a shovel, one that years ago probably old Caleb himself had used. Now, one thing I should tell you is that even though Caleb in his prime was a big, strong fellow, he had suffered an injury as a child that left him with a little bit of a limp sometimes on those cold, moist days, and he might use that shovel like a cane to kind of get about. Well, when one of the ne'er-do-wells saw that shovel, he grabbed it and he began to imitate the way that old Caleb would walk when he needed that shovel as a cane, and said, "Who am I?" Well, his partner, of course, knew who he was, and they thought that was quite clever and funny. Well, the fellow without the shovel began to hurl crabapples at his partner, who fended them off with the shovel, but eventually he realized, well, this is kind of fun. Wait a minute, throw another one of those crabapples at me. And he put that shovel up against his shoulder like a baseball bat, and he whacked it. And that crabapple splintered, of course, sending fragments over the both of them. Well, they thought that was hilarious, and they had quite a bit of fun with that. They took turns with the shovel, batting the crabapples, working their way through the graveyard until eventually they had found their way near the statue of Francis Reynolds' grave. Well, one terrible sweep of the shovel happened to hit the head of that statue, knocking it from its shoulders. Well, you and I would be horrified to think that we had desecrated a grave in such a way, to vandalize a statue, decapitating it, in fact. But these two fellows thought it was the funniest thing that they'd ever seen. And the fellow that didn't have the shovel said, "Give me that." And he went and found another statue, and whack, he hit another head and knocked it off. Well, off they went through the graveyard, knocking arms and heads off the statues. Well, had they been a little bit more observant, they might have noticed a dark, shadowy substance come out from behind one of the crypts and follow them through the graveyard. Now, I need to take you to another location in the graveyard, yet another statue here that's missing its head. Here's the statue of young Delma Rainey. She was just 7 years old when she died. Well, the next morning, when the caretaker for the graveyard came to make his rounds in the cemetery, when he came upon this particular gravesite and the statue of Delma Rainey, he was met with a most disturbing sight. For there, first of all, leaning against the statue, was a shovel, a bloody shovel. And on the ground before the statue, 2 heads. Not statue heads, human heads. And I think you know just whose they were. Well, perhaps old Caleb got his revenge after all. What's that? Oh my. Well, people often have said that if you waited long enough on a moonlit night like this, you just might see old Caleb in the graveyard. I think it's safe now for you to make your way through the graveyard. But if old Caleb stops to offer you a light, I think I'd decline. Well, that ends our tale for tonight. Please come back for another dark ride. And remember that my Christmas-themed collection of horror stories called The 13th Day of Christmas and Other Tales of Yuletide Horror is available on gestaltmedia.com. Thank you for riding with us.